One of the problems with doing the gospel conversations when you're one of the participants is when it comes to Sunday, you feel, well, I've already said everything I wanted to say about that, which isn't entirely true when it comes to that amazing parable. But I would say, if you want to find out more about the parable, go and have a listen to the gospel conversation, because I really want to focus more on the Old Testament reading today. It's not to say the parable has got nothing to do with what I've got to say, because I want to head off on a little bit of a tangent and think about three things: contentment, trust, and rest. We've just sung that beautiful version of the Lord's Prayer, which is all about trust, and how these two readings can give us an angle on that to think about. So we've got this glorious parable of God's totally undeserved grace to us. And, hang on to that, because that's really what the parable is about. But the thing that struck me most when I was looking at it earlier in the week was the question of why the laborers who arrived first weren't content with their wage, because it was a fair wage. It was the wage they had expected. It was the wage they'd been promised and worked for, and it was enough to feed their families for a few days. But as soon as they found that someone else was going to get the same amount for less work, they weren't content anymore. And it shows us that contentment is very fragile and very easy to lose. If we move to the Exodus story, here we've got a group of people who were slaves, and now they're out in the desert and they are anything but content. We hear of the fear of the Israelites that they're going to starve in the desert, and of the free gift of quails and manna. And incidentally, any of you who don't know, I love this. The word manna essentially comes from the people of Israel saying, what's this? Because that's what it sounds like in Hebrew. So that's what manna is. But it's total grace, total gift. And they're given some clear instructions about using this gift to get the most out of it. They're told clearly that they're not to keep any manna overnight, because there'll be plenty for them the next day, with one exception. And that exception is that on the sixth day, they're to collect enough for 2 days, because the seventh day is to be a day of rest. Now, naturally, they mess up both parts of that instruction. First, people hoard manna overnight during the week, presumably not trusting that there's going to be enough for tomorrow. And the result is that it goes off and it's full of maggots overnight. Eek! Now, that puts them off, which means that rather than keeping it overnight on the sixth day as they've been told to, they don't, and they try to find some on the Sabbath. And of course, there is none. Meanwhile, those who trusted and collected the 2 days' worth on the sixth day find that there's been no maggots, no rotting. It's still perfect the next day. So, contentment and trust, two very difficult things. Contentment with having enough regardless of what others get, and trust that it will be enough, that it will be sufficient. And our problem is this isn't the message that the world is shouting at us. Our world's financial structures depend on creating discontent and greed and worry in us. So I guess the question I'm challenging myself with is, how do we develop the contentment and trust muscles in ourselves, as if we were working out to try and build up the strength? And so I want to suggest there's one thing that I am now beginning to try, and so I'm a total learner in all this as well, and that's to take the Sabbath seriously. The Sabbath, whose practices for the Jewish people began with this story of the manna. So they haven't got the commandments yet. They haven't yet been told officially that the seventh day has to be a day of rest. This is the first example of having a day off each week, a day off from having to bend over and scoop up enough manna for the family. It's Sabbath is a gift. So when I say Sabbath, you've got to ensure you're not thinking of those ridiculous rules and regulations that the Pharisees invented. nor of the totally joyless Sabbath that Protestants in the 17th and 18th century tended to inflict on their children. Sabbath, as the Old Testament gives to us, and as most Jewish people in most times have practiced it, was a celebration, a time primarily for family, but also for music and for games and for reading and for good food, for relaxing, whether you were rich or poor, whether you were slave or free, whether you were a human or an animal. Everybody got to rest. And it's a time for things that were important rather than the things that were urgent. A time for nurturing relationships, for the love and joy which is so often sacrificed to sheer busyness. And if you think about it, the first thing that God did with the human being that he'd created in Genesis was to put them in a garden and tell them to enjoy eating all the fruit that they'd been given. We have a God who delights in our delights and who's built rest and joy into the cycle of time. Sabbath isn't a task, it's a gift, it's a joy, it's a taste of Eden and a rehearsing of the new creation. The wonderful Rabbi Jonathan Sacks talks about it as a day where we should be set free, free from pressures, from demands, from expectations. And I'd argue that it teaches us to be free from discontent and free from distrust. Because for one day a week, we're content with the work we've done and we let it go. We trust that there will be another day and that the world will not end if we take one day to free ourselves from emails. For one day a week, we're content with what we have and we don't feel the need to rush out and buy more. We trust we've got enough. For one day a week, we put our reputations and our frantic attempts to seem important into God's hands and don't attempt to do anything impressive or justify our existence through busyness. We trust ourselves and what others think of us to God. We live in a pandemic of busyness. It's ridiculous, really, isn't it? Everybody is so busy. We know perfectly well it's bad for us, but we seem to be incapable of stopping. And the simple truth is that if we feel we're too busy to stop everything for a day, we desperately need to do so. To keep working, to stay on that relentless treadmill that the world expects of us, is in the end to doubt God. To doubt that the manna will still be given to us tomorrow. To doubt that God, our Creator, knows what we need to live well and fully. To rest in the Sabbath is to put our lives for 24 hours into the hands of the God who loves us, content with who we are and what we have, and trusting that God can take care of the rest. It's a gift. So let's think seriously about accepting it. Amen.